Simon Sebag Montefiore is a British historian, television presenter, and the author of a number of very, very popular history books and some novels. And I'm thrilled to have him on for the second time because the last time we spoke to him, it was for our podcast series on history called Blind History. And we spoke about some of the books that he's already written. But my goodness, do we have a reason to talk to him today? First of all, Simon, what a pleasure to see you. And thank you
Great
for
to see
making some
you.
time for us.
Great to be back with you and to talk again.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, congratulations on this volume, which is absolutely, I mean, people talk about, well done on your book. And, you say that especially to a first time author and they go, oh, thank you so much. But my God, this is a magnum opus. I mean, this is really quite something.
Thank you.
You've written the history of the world, and it is nothing short of a phenomenon. And by the way, congratulations, because I saw on your Instagram that it is the Times History Book of the Year, which is another good reason to buy it and look at it and read it this Christmas, because quite apart from being very beautiful, it contains the most wonderful and beautiful stories. I just love the idea that you essentially decided to tell the story of history through families.
That's right. That's right. I mean, what I wanted to get was I wanted to write a book that combined the span of world history with all the sort of huge movements, the advances in technology, the convergences and divergences, and at the same time that had the intimacy, the grit, the juice, if you like, of biography. And it occurred to me that that a family history of the world might work. And so I embarked on this somewhat insane but actually delightful project that's really been an amazing experience to write.
Well, you have written a number of very, very successful books already, but this one is probably, just judging by how much work must have gone into it, this is probably your biggest project to date, I'm sure.
Oh, by far. I mean, it's by far the biggest project I'll probably ever do in my life. And like I said, when I embarked on it, I sort of realized that it was going to be bigger than I thought and harder than I thought. I mean, writing all books is hard, but this was especially challenging because it's all one narrative, so everything had to sort of fit in and link up, and so it was a daunting prospect, but also really satisfactory. And as it turned out, of course, it's for the readers to decide if they enjoy it, but it worked. It is one narrative. It does all hang together, and the style of doing it is original. I mean, no one's done this before, and I was going
to ask you actually. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen history presented in this way before, and obviously you're an experienced hand at telling stories, and you've done the most incredible work, particularly on Russian history, which I've absolutely loved every step of the way. And I most recently read your book on Jerusalem, which I also adored. And here, this is probably the most ambitious task anyone could wish to tell, because it's the story of humanity from its earliest origins in terms of King Sargon, for heaven's sake, and the ziggurats of Ur. But how long did it take you to start putting this together? I mean, there's a picture that you also shared of you in between just thousands of books in your office, which you must have had to, kind of almost wind your way like a labyrinth through. How long did it take you, and how much reading and research did you have to do as experienced and powerful of a historian as you yourself are, and how much must already be in your head? I mean, this looks like a lot of source material.
Yeah, well, that picture really catches it. By the way, that's a South African leopard's head there from my last trip in South Africa, which I love. And so I keep it there as a sort of paperweight on top of a heap of books on Africa. But yeah, I mean, the way that office catches the sort of chaos and the sort of, one has to master an enormous number of subjects to sort of get something like this off the ground. And it's like sort of, one has to sort of go on reads for each subject. So each of those piles of books in that photograph are a subject geographical area, like, but they're like ancient Egypt or southern Central Africa in the 19th century or the Arab world or whatever. Britain, America, Cambodia, whatever. And so what I did in each thing was I read I read the general histories on those subjects, but then I tried to get into the academic and scholarly stuff so that I could bring a new take on
Mm.
many subjects. And but of course, by the end, I could barely get into my office or out of it. I mean, it's all still here, in fact, around me now. I have to sort of almost crawl into this office to I'm just sort of, you can see down here, you can see that it's all still a terrible mess. Um,
Amazing.
but but as the picture shows, it's just an extraordinary experience doing this. And I really enjoyed it, actually. But there were times I just felt I didn't sleep for about 3 years.
Well, did you feel at the end almost a sense of relief, or was it so much fun doing it because you do love reading and understanding and researching history? It's part of what makes your own writing so charming, and you make it easy for the rest of us to think we're discovering things anew. And there is that scholarly and academic stuff which most of the pedestrian historians don't really get to participate in. Some of it in languages that are no longer spoken, and from source documents that are in you know museums and airtight libraries where they no longer see the sun, or have to be observed with gloves.
Yeah,
And you must have got your hands dirty a little bit there too. It also strikes me as
always.
interesting. Sorry, answer that question before I bring in more. Yeah,
No, no.
the
I mean, the
relief,
whole fun is. I mean,
or
the
the
whole
actual
fun.
process.
Yeah, I mean, the whole fun of it was just, um, complete. It was just entering all these new worlds and working on working on them, penetrating them, immersing oneself in them, and then deciding I've got enough to do that. I've got enough on that subject. Now I need to get on to the next subject. And so the way I work is like I master a subject and then I move on. So by the time I start writing, the idea is that I know where everything goes and where it's and if I've got enough on it. But obviously, in this case, I was continually find new books were coming out all the time. I had to read them all and add them and encompass them into the book. So it was a lot of fun. But in answer to your question, was it a relief? It's the biggest relief. Just seeing you holding the book is just the greatest
Yeah.
joy to think that I've actually the book actually exists. There were times when I thought I'd never complete it because once I'd started it, I realized it was so ambitious and so big, that I was going to be, it was, would I ever finish it? I sometimes wondered if I really would. And it's just a joy to see it in your hands. Yeah, where holding it up, and I'm very proud of it. And it's such a relief. I can sort of feel like, I feel like I can relax this Christmas.
Well, I hope that everyone who's listening to this is inspired already to buy it. I mean, did your publishers put any kind of preconditions on it for you? I mean, it has to be this
No.
long, or it has to be, because you must have reached a certain page count and gone, "Oof, I wonder if I've overdone this, or maybe they're going to try and edit it down and remove some of the stuff that I really loved putting in." You can't get too attached, can you?
No, I mean, you've got to be really ruthless. You've got to be able to drown kittens. And but actually it could be as long as a book could be, but no longer, obviously, because I wanted it to be in one volume. So that was the sort of
Right.
that was the sort of limit. But the thing is that they didn't try and limit me, because the point is there are lots of short histories of the world. And there are also, long, rather sort of textbooky kind of histories of the world. And this is neither of those. Um, and as for length, it's funny because people say, "Oh, is it? Is it quite long?" Well, it's the same length as the latest book of biography of Winston Churchill, and it's the same length as the latest biography of umpteen American presidents. There's a new book about President Ulysses Grant, U.S.
Yeah.
Grant. There's a new book about President Woodrow Wilson. Um, they're exactly the same length as this, and this book has biographies of all of those people in it as well. So it's actually the right length for what I wanted to do.
But it must have been very difficult to decide how much to keep in and how much to leave out, because in some of these stories, especially the ones that you know best and that you love best, there must have been a temptation to tell a little bit more than, almost to give everybody equal time must have been a very, very difficult thing to do. And I don't like to compare authors, but I've always said that one of the most extraordinary achievements of someone like Yuval Noah Harari is that he managed to condense what is an extremely complicated and pithy and full life's work in terms of studying history into a single book. And you have the same ability, which is almost more impressive than your already well-known abilities as a historian, to be able to say, I'm going to just include this much. I'm not going to include all of this. I'll give you the gist.
That's right. I mean, I really thought hard about each subject, and I thought, first of all, what is the essence of this? I mean, first of all, I had to decide what to use as the tether for an important subject, whether it's new technologies or the Black Death or whatever. Who was I going to use as my tether? Because that's the idea. That's the idea behind the book. Is anyone can read this book. You don't have to know anything. It's totally accessible. It can be regarded as an entertainment, but also it has the scholarship um, underneath it and beneath it, and that provides a sort of framework that if you want, if you're serious about historiography, then you can find a new take, an up-to-date take, a challenging take that challenges the conventional wisdom if you want. But I don't. What I do in the book is I don't sort of lecture. I don't polemicize. I really follow the kind of rules, show and tell, and it can be read by anybody. And then then I just try and get to the essence of the subject, usually through the people. And the people can be a family, an individual, a woman, a man, a child, somebody who some group of people, a coterie of people that made the changed the world or linked to this development. And that's the really fun thing. So I really hope to sort of bring alive these people, and that's the great challenge of all historians, isn't it? But I think Harari's book is great. This is very different. That's sort of
Very different.
anthropological. That really is about the species. Mine is the opposite, if you like. It's the antidote to that. And in fact, the Financial Times just reviewed it this weekend and said exactly that. They said, one of the criticisms of Jared Diamond, guns, germs,
Guns, germs, and steel.
and of Harari's Sapiens is that they're sort of the actual individuals are too far removed for it, and it says, and this is the antidote to it, and that's exactly what I wanted it to be. It's literally the antidote to those two brilliant books. And of course, there's no point in reinventing the wheel. They've done those books brilliantly, but this is a book that I was sort of born to write.
Did you feel any pressure to give equal time? I mean, you really do go all over the world, and you cover some people in history who I am embarrassed to admit I didn't know anything about, which I think is terrific. I mean, what's the point of reading something that you already know? But there were stories about people and about families and about events and about things that occurred in history that we would have all been fascinated to know that I had no idea had occurred. And it is thanks to this tour that we do through time and through all these different places on the planet. Did you feel pressure to have to make it all kind of the same?
No pressure. No pressure at all, because I've always wanted to write exactly this book, funny enough. But obviously, in the last 10 years, history's changed a bit, and it's now expected that there's much more diversity, there's much more about women and women's history, and all those things are brilliant developments, which are huge improvements, because actually it was far too European. It was far too centered on men, European men often, or North American and European men. But what's great about doing families is they're very families can be as diverse as you like, and all families are a product of some sort of hybridity, some mixture of peoples and places and times, and so actually it's just suited this perfectly. So yeah, I mean, I wanted it to be as diverse as possible. And what I decided really early on, and this applies to this covers your part of the world, is that it was going to be families, I decided to do something which hadn't really been done before, which is to treat the Zulu royal family, or the ruling families of Benin or Mali, or the Ghanas, to treat all those families exactly as I would treat the Rothschilds, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, or the dynasties that we're used to, the Windsors. And so that's what I've done. So
Yeah.
you really are, they are treated exactly the same way, and the same with different parts of the world. There's just as much Africa as there is Europe, and there's an enormous amount on Asia in this book. But I just
Yeah.
sort of wanted to judge what was important, what I felt was important, and also what's interesting. And it's got all the sort of familiar characters that you'd expect. Mandela, from Mandela to Churchill to
Hmm.
Frederick the Great to Nebuchadnezzar and Cleopatra. But it also is, the whole point of it is, it's full of people that you probably don't know about. I didn't know about a lot of them beforehand. So that's been the great
Oh
joy
yeah.
of it for me.
Yeah, there is this temptation though among historians to almost rank things. You know how they and it has been the case since the dawn of time. We call this person Alexander the Great, as opposed to Alexander, who was also a king and who also did some conquering. So there's this temptation to kind of look at everything through this lens of history, and then of course as far back as you can go, it becomes more mysterious, and therefore they probably have more superhuman abilities, or they look to be more impressive. And of course,
That's right.
with with the perspective of much less time, we tend to be a lot harder on people. Today is the day, actually, uh, almost, I think, 9 years ago to the day that Nelson Mandela died, and already you're getting these hagiographies and these biographies about him where he wasn't this and he wasn't enough of that, and we haven't even seen 9 years go by yet.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's the point. I mean, in this book, you'll find these kind of great brand names of history, but I treat them slightly differently. I mean, Alexander the Great is a good example. I mean, he was an
Mm,
astonishing personality. Um, there was lots that we don't know, and but at the same time, I place him in his family, in the Macedonian Argead dynasty. So you kind of meet his family from a couple of centuries before he's even born, and when you deal with him, you just realize, like, he was this kind of pretty ferocious sort of warlord, probably a pretty thuggish character,
mm,
and certainly, he killed a lot of his own sort of closest friends, and so when you look at the evidence, he's kind of less perfect than he's usually treated. And I'm sure the same is true with later characters, the Mandelas, or the Thatchers, the
yeah.
Gorbachevs, and so on. All of them are in this book, and the whole point is just to reassess them and treat them like they're humans. And in my own life, I've been lucky because I've known quite a lot of these. I've known quite a lot of these kind of some titanic figures, some politicians in all sorts of countries, and they've read my books, and through that I've got to know them, or I've covered them in
Mm,
some way as a war correspondent or whatever. And you know, I've brought that to the book as well. So the last 50 years has quite a lot of these people. But the one thing you realize is that, you know, um, often politicians just get lucky, or they get unlucky, and they're actually, you kind of get it, you kind of realize that they're pretty, that many of them are pretty ordinary people, just in extraordinary situations. And of course, we end the book with Putin and Zelensky, who are both
yeah.
examples of that in a way.
Well, I mean, I will save that question for a little bit later on, because that's an ongoing story and something which you understand from a historical perspective probably better than anyone I'll get to talk to in my life. So I'll hear from you in a moment about that, if we can save that for right at the end. But you also wrote this during COVID, which, I mean, when COVID came along, obviously we were all thinking, oh no, this is the worst thing that could happen. And we were all mostly nervous about how badly it would affect us, the ones we love, our countries, all the rest of it. But there must have been some small part of you that went, aha, this is what I've been waiting for in order to approach a subject and a project of this enormity. Thank you very much. I'll start now.
It wasn't quite like that, but actually it was a kind of blessing for me, because I'm just not sure I could have ever written this in any other time, because my
Mm,
family were in the country. I was in London in this office, working away, and I literally it was like a in those mafia movies, like when they go to the mattresses, they just kind of camp in a house with sort of shotguns and wait for during one of those mafia. It was a bit like that. I sort of went to the mattresses. I
Right.
was just living for this book. I was like going to sleep at a sort of certain time, getting up at dawn, working all day, then going for a run or trying to do some exercise and sort of do, you know, but I was like total immersement, total obsession. And that's the only way to get these giant projects done. Um, and as for the COVID, actually, I mean, at the time when I was writing it, I happened to start on literally the day of the first lockdown in 2020. I think it was March or the end of February,
March
March.
20.
And and actually I sort of quickly realized that actually this was a kind of, in a way, useful for me. It was a great time for writers, actually, just to sort of be writing because it was so intense and focused. But also, obviously pandemics and epidemics and plagues played a big part in world history. And so that really concentrated the mind. And we were living through one, and that was interesting. And I was planning to end the book on the day the first person died in Wuhan of COVID. But then, of course, Ukraine happened, and that
Yeah.
changed it. And then I already had a lot of Ukraine and Russia in the book, obviously, because those are subjects that are close to my heart and are very important. Um, it's one of the ironies, isn't it, that
Yeah.
half of the academic world now is concentrating on sort of writing about imperialism and colonialism, and yet that none of them were writing about an actual empire that was actually malignly expanding and planning expansion right now, right in front of them, and none of them noticed it. Anyway, that's as it is. But I then changed the end of the book so that it ended on the day of the invasion.
So let's since we're in this territory already, but
Yeah,
Russia's had this series of calamities, and now, once again, the people of that part of the world are plunged into a war of, whatever the making of a megalomaniac, or whatever reason you choose, because it's all, to most people, immaterial what started it, but they're in it. And the people of the Ukraine and the people of Russia now are forced to sacrifice their children and grandchildren and their economies and their lives and the way that they live for yet another conflict. Do you think Russia's particularly unlucky, especially having looked at the whole world in your book, or do you think that they've just earned a reputation for that because of the way that they've dealt with it?
well, I think Russia's unusual in that it is a country that was founded as an empire. Peter the Great founded the Russian Empire, gave it the name Russia. Really comparatively recently, because when we look at the world, we think everything's been around forever. Of course, it hasn't.
Mm.
Russia, he founded Russia in the 1720s, really, um, and he founded it as an expansive empire, and it hasn't really changed its view of itself and the world radically since. It hasn't found a way to go beyond that vision. All the other countries in the world have, maybe except China, but um, so that mindset has, it hasn't really changed. I mean, obviously there was sort of, the Soviet Union was of course very radically different in many ways, um, but it also adopted that messianic sort of mission to the world, but adapting it to Marxism, Leninism, encompassing Marxism, Leninism with it, and then the Putin regime has adapted parts of both those regimes as well, and added to it a sort of ultranationalism, which is very modern. So so for the Russian people, they haven't really gone beyond um, this quite aggressive vision of what the Russian state is. And of course, it doesn't mean that Russia's only destined to be this kind of country. I mean, there's no reason why one day Russia shouldn't be a democracy like anywhere else. Um, but equally, the Russian state itself, maybe it will fall apart. Maybe it will disintegrate if this war fails, and it looks like it's going to. Maybe this will finally cure it of its imperial persona, which has never managed to shake off so far.
Does it strike you as interesting or annoying that so many people have a very simplistic view of history. They tend to think, well, if I can just get you to this point in history, then you'll understand why my version of whatever happened afterwards is a better version than someone else's. And you see this all over the world. If we could just blame imperialism, if we could just blame conquest, if we could just blame um, cultural suppression and cultural kind of submission. We look at ancient Rome. Many of the nations and the families that you cover in your book are guilty of all kinds of dreadful things. And depending on where you take it back to, you can quite conveniently blame some of those along the way. Where if you did a more nuanced approach to the whole thing, you'd have a lot harder time ascribing guilt.
I think that's right. I mean, guilt is an interesting subject in history. I mean, first of all, history that's fitted into any kind of straitjacket of ideology isn't history. It's polemic, and
Mm,
so we were brought up with a certain vision in Britain of sort of Britain's sort of you know philanthropic role in world history. And that was an ideology. Um, but now academia is dominated by a vision that all sort of, especially British Empire, is a sort of incredible, vast criminal enterprise. That's also an ideology, and that's equally wrong. And so, in this book, for example, I just try and I try and find as close as I can to what I think is the right approach, and that includes looking at the world in the whole. That's the whole point of global history, but also just not following conventional wisdom about guilt. I mean, I do think one has to show victims, whoever they are. That means, you mentioned hierarchies earlier. That means not having a hierarchy of victims and of goodies
mm,
and baddies, for example. I
mm,
mean, I think um, that everyone counts or no one counts. So in this book, I try and show as many people who are killed um, by by Asian leaders as I do by European leaders, for example. In the history of India, and the same in
right.
Africa. So I think that's kind of important. Everyone counts or no one counts, and I try and follow that rule in this book. I try not to be controlled by any ideology, but equally there are things. It's impossible. It's impossible to completely divorce oneself from the present and the obsessions of the present. For example, there's a lot about empire in this book, but not just the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Zulu Empire.
Hmm.
Other empires that are also important. And at the same time, we're very obsessed with slavery now. Well, that's a very important subject that was neglected a long time. So there's a lot about Atlantic slavery, the vast crime of Atlantic slavery. But at the same time, we look at other slaveries that were just as enormous. And, no one really studies that. They should be studied much more widely. So that's, for example, Mediterranean slavery,
Yeah.
East
Well,
African slavery is a huge subject.
even the kind that is still going on to this day.
Yeah.
You know, there's
I
there's
mean,
so much
yes,
that it's this, and the cover of your book. I've got to just compliment you on that, because if there's ever been an attempt to kind of show a whole lot of cultural and in a very small space, it's beautifully done. It also can serve just as well as that leopard head that you've got as a paperweight, which when I wasn't reading it in my office, it's been sitting there, and I sort of want to display it. It's a nice book to show
good.
people.
I mean, but yeah, I worked really hard on the cover because I had a vision of
Beautiful.
the cover. I wanted it to look, I didn't want it to look like any other book that's ever been. And you very rarely see on history books those African and Brazilian colors.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. With the
and so,
Chinese dragons
and the
and the
Chinese
kind of
dragons.
and the Ottoman sort of mosaic background. It's beautiful. It's
That's
beautifully
right.
done.
That's right. So that's sort of captures some of the nature of the book and the breadth
So,
of its approach.
so you said something interesting just now about being able to sort of talk about who killed, but very often history is just the story of the victors and the story of the battles. And what I liked about this is that even right at the beginning, you talk about King Sargon's daughter, and what was done to her, and later on to Boudica and many others along the way, and the story of these women who history just says, oh well, she was conquered, she was taken out by this guy, and they spend much more time talking about the guy. And I think one of the benefits of being around now is that there is this emphasis on the stories that were less well told, the stories that were less about grandiosity, more about human experience.
That's right. I mean, that's the fun thing about one of the great things about family history is the history of women, and that's one of the great, um, really positive developments of this new history. Um, and of course, women are hugely important in families, clearly biologically, but also, they came to power in family, in
Mm.
dynasties, and they became hugely important. Sometimes they arrived as slaves, as enslaved persons. Sometimes they came to power as the wives or widows or mothers of powerful people, princes. Um, but the whole fun of this book, and one of the things I'm proud of, is the number of women shown in the book,
Oh yeah.
introduced in the book. And like you said, some of them are Boudica and Cleopatra and Margaret Thatcher and Indira Gandhi. Um, but some of them are an Idia or in Benin and so on. But some
Yes.
of them are women that you won't have heard of, and we all should have heard of them. And so, they play huge roles in this book. And it really, I mean, I suppose the surprise of it is, if it is a surprise, is that, they're no better than the men, actually.
Well,
They're,
that's my. I was going to say those Julia Claudian women. I mean, Messalina and Agrippina, and these were not very nice people.
no, I
they were
mean,
they were in some ways more ambitious even than the men in those stories.
yeah, I mean, there are certain families, or where to be a character in that family, to be a player, you have to play the game of politics, whether you're a man or a woman, and in systems of personal power,
Mm.
the fight for power is absolute and very personal, and I think that's one of the themes of the book, and you see that all over the world today, just as you always have.
When you talk about the themes of the book, apart from the family and the individual stories, it does seem to me that there's sort of this play on whether or not women and men have the same approach to power, and whether men and women have the same approach to history. Even did you come to any profound conclusions after studying these people in such great detail and weaving this tapestry together?
Um, just that they have they have the same approach. I mean, there are all sorts of themes about family within the book. I mean, one is the influence and the importance of powerful mothers, and
Mm.
another. I mean, on families themselves. I mean, you know, you obviously one sort of looks at family in detail here. I mean, of course, the biological family we all have. In some ways, we're all part of dynasties. That's the great thing about family
Yeah.
history, and that's this fashion for looking into family histories now. This book is very much part of that. Um, but in terms of families with our surnames, and and the idea of primogeniture, or a family with the name of a dynasty, I mean
and
that
and
is
and
really,
here and here in Africa, tribe, and how
yes.
important that clan, tribe, language, cultural identities become.
That's all really, I mean, that's all very much part of the book. And, one of
Mm.
the interesting things that's happening, now is in much of the world, family connections, family power families are coming back. And it looked like they were going to vanish forever. And, all the states, all the new states in Africa, for example, and in Asia, post-colonialism, adopted the structures of often of American democracy, sometimes British democracy, but they kind of had a presidency,
Mhm.
elections, legislatures, but actually a lot of them, um, became sort of effectively autocracies, or monarchies. And if you look at the world, especially in Asia today, um, family, you see dynastic reversion. You see powerful families, um, taking control again, and that's because states have failed to deliver the kind of security and justice that people expect, and they can get it. They feel they can get it most from their tribe, from their clan,
Yeah.
from their dynasty.
There seems to be a little disappointment in democracy at the moment, and we had a new Zulu king enthroned just this year. the seventh or eighth in line from King Shaka, who you also cover in your book beautifully. It does seem to me that there is this, but then history is also, the old medieval wheel of fortune that,
Yeah,
the king climbs on, and as he's in the ascendant, then he's sitting enthroned and in all his glory at the top, and then falls from grace and is eventually, trampled underfoot. This is the story of so many nations and so many families and so many individuals all over the world, isn't it?
that's the whole point of the book, really. It's like it's that you put your finger on it. I mean, no one, even the victors, no one stays on top for long. It's a relentless game of power, and we look at it both in terms of little families and but also in terms of great powers and empires and states, and none of them last for long. And I think one rule is though about empires is that the more tolerant they are, the more open they are, the longer they last. So the Roman Empire, which made everybody in the empire a citizen, lasts 1,000 years almost.
Mm.
Um, the Nazi Empire in Europe in World War II lasts 4 years because they exclude so many people with such brutality. So if there's any lesson, that's one of the lessons, that tolerance really pays in matters of state. Um, but you're right. I mean, we cover many victors, but one of the things I wanted to do was not to have this as a victor's history. So though it's got all the great powers and famous kingdoms that you'd have heard of, has the Zulus, of course, has many African realms and kingdoms and families, but and of course it has Russia and America and the British Empire and the French Empire and the Chinese Empire, but it also has lots of smaller countries that people don't normally read about, the Albanians and the Cambodians. Many the sort of the rebel slave kingdom of Palmares in northern
Yeah.
Brazil. Lots of places that I think people should know about and can enjoy. Haiti, for example, is a fascinating example, or Hawaii.
Wow.
So, I really took pleasure in covering those sort of places as well.
Haiti was fantastic. I mean, the problem for someone like me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but perhaps also for you, is you go down a rabbit hole and you can get very easily distracted because suddenly you find yourself so engrossed in the story of Haiti, particularly its foundation, Napoleon's links to that time in French history, the colony itself, these uprisings, the way in that island, people, there were the white whites and the black blacks, and then there were the black whites and the white blacks, and it was very, very complicated. And
Correct.
the personalities of all these people come, and before you know it, you're reading 7 books about that as well, and now you've lost your way. It must be very disciplined about
Oh,
these
I'm
things if you
I'm
were
always
writing.
losing my way. I'm the greatest for that. I mean, this book is really the result of 1,000 trips down rabbit holes, and that's the whole fun. I mean, that's the whole fun of the book, and that's why there are lots of sort of interesting footnotes that have stuff that I just couldn't resist. Um, but it's not just about statesmen and royal dynasties. There's also rock stars and
Yeah,
mafiosi
yeah,
and architects and artists and poets, and it's got a lot of the dark matter of history, but it's also a celebration of sort of human ingenuity and joy and creativity and sex and love and
yeah.
all of that. Music.
Well, the Habsburgs are in a few more than one chapter, and really, I mean, they lasted a very long time as a family, didn't they? But you've
Yeah.
got the Kims, the Kims in North Korea. You've got some others in Ghana, Sadat in Jerusalem. I mean, there's some amazing, amazing stories here.
Yeah. I mean, it's got a lot of the families of today and it's got a lot of the situations of today, but it's also, goes right back to the Medicis and the Borgias and the Caesars. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, it's all it, it's
amazing.
it's all there. And I think, as I said, it's a sort of indictment of humanity, but also a great celebration. And I hope you all enjoy it.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end it on than that. Simon, it's such a great pleasure to speak to you again. Really, the warmest of congratulations on writing such an incredible work. And I hope that many people will take to this as their first journey into history because it does, as you say, come to you from wherever you may be. You don't need to be a historian to enjoy this book. And the stories in it will inspire many more people to write many more books, I should think.
Thank you. And it's great to talk to you again. More
Thank you.
soon.
Yes, absolutely. Lovely to speak to you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Same to you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.